There's a moment that happens every single time a beautiful woman meets a new man, and almost no man ever notices it happening to him. It takes about 10 seconds, and it is running quietly beneath the small talk, the eye contact, the first exchange of names. You have lived through this moment more times than you can count. And almost every time, you have walked away from it without knowing what actually took place. This isn't because you were careless, and it is not because you weren't paying attention. It's because the thing being evaluated has almost nothing to do with what most men are trained to notice. Somewhere along the way, you learn to focus on the wrong signals entirely. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. There is one specific thing a beautiful woman is quietly checking for in those first 10 seconds. Something most men never once pass and never realize they failed. By the end of this video, you will see that moment clearly, understand why beauty makes it more intense, and know what she is quietly hoping you will give her that almost no man ever does. Ask most men what a beautiful woman wants, and they'll describe her like a prize instead of a person. He'll talk about her looks, her attention, what it would mean to be chosen by her. It's an understandable mistake, and almost every man makes some version of it. Somewhere along the way, beauty gets treated as the entire story. Of course, attraction plays a role. That would be naive to deny. But the assumption that beautiful women simply want more admiration is where most men go quietly wrong. Behavioral researchers who study attention and identity have found something counterintuitive. The more consistently someone is admired for a single trait, the more that trait starts to feel disconnected from who they actually are. That's a mouthful, so let's make it simple. When a woman is complimented on her looks constantly by strangers, co-workers, men in every setting she enters, that compliment stops feeling personal. It starts to feel like weather, something that happens to her, not something anyone actually sees her for. Now, you might be thinking, surely more attention is still better than none, even if some of it is shallow. But repetition changes the meaning of a signal, the same way a word repeated too many times starts to lose its shape. A compliment said once, by someone who clearly means it, lands differently than the same compliment said for the 1,000th time by a stranger who will forget her face by tomorrow. Beautiful women learn this distinction early, without ever putting words to it. So if attention isn't the scarce resource in her life, what actually is? That question sits underneath everything else in this video, and we're going to answer it properly, piece by piece, until it becomes something you can recognize in an actual conversation, not just something you nod along to. But first, you need to understand something most men never think about: the hidden cost of being looked at all day, every day, by people who don't actually know her. Picture her walking into a room. Before she said a single word, 12 people have already formed an opinion about her. Some are curious, some are dismissive. A few are already writing a story about who she is, based entirely on how she looks. She hasn't spoken yet, and she is already being narrated. This happens constantly, not occasionally, and it starts young. Psychologists who study social evaluation call this the halo and horn effect, where a single visible trait, in this case attractiveness, colors every assumption a stranger makes about intelligence, personality, even trustworthiness. In plain terms, people decide who she is before they know anything real about her. Over years, that adds up to something you might not expect: a low-grade exhaustion, a habit of bracing for evaluation the moment she enters a space. Think of it like walking into every room already halfway through a performance you never agreed to give. The audience has opinions before the show has started, and some of those opinions are generous, others less so. Either way, she rarely gets to simply exist in a room without being assessed first, without earning a moment of neutral space. Now, you might be thinking, isn't that just a nice problem to have, all things considered? But the exhaustion is real, and it shapes behavior in a specific way. It teaches her to filter people fast, not because she's guarded, but because she has learned, through repetition, that most people are reacting to a surface instead of a person. Here's a specific version of what that filtering looks like in practice. A man says something within the first minute that could have been said to any attractive stranger. A comment about her smile, a slightly overeager compliment, a joke that feels rehearsed because he's used it before, somewhere else, on someone else. Her attention doesn't spike. If anything, it quietly recedes, even while she stays polite on the surface. That's not coldness. It's pattern recognition built from years of near-identical interactions, repeated so often they blur together. This explains something that confuses a lot of men: why a woman can seem warm for an entire conversation and still walk away unaffected. Warmth, for her, is often just good manners layered over a much more selective process underneath. Politeness is cheap. Real attention is not. Of course, this doesn't mean she's calculating or cold. Quite the opposite, usually. It simply means she has learned which reactions to take seriously. That filtering isn't random, and it isn't vague intuition either. It's running on a very specific internal test, one that happens almost entirely below conscious awareness. And that test is exactly where most men, without realizing it, quietly fail. Here's what's actually happening in that first 10 seconds. And it has almost nothing to do with what you say. It has almost nothing to do with confidence, charm, or how smoothly the conversation flows. What she is unconsciously reading is much simpler and much harder to fake. She is checking whether you are responding to her specifically or responding to the general category she belongs to. Read that again, because it's the whole video in one sentence. When a man reacts to a beautiful woman the way he would react to beauty in general, a slightly too quick compliment, eyes that linger a beat too long, questions that could apply to any attractive stranger. Something in her registers it instantly, not as an insult, as familiarity. She has seen this exact reaction hundreds of times before, and her brain files it accordingly. Generic response, low signal, move on. But when a man responds to something specific, a detail in what she said, a small inconsistency he noticed, a reaction that wouldn't make sense unless he was actually listening, that registers completely differently. Cognitive scientists refer to this as source specificity, the brain's ability to detect whether a response is tailored to a unique stimulus or simply pattern matched to a category. In plain language, her mind can tell the difference between a reaction to her and a reaction to beauty walking through a door. Here's a small, observable example of the difference. Say she mentions, almost as an aside, that she drove 40 minutes out of her way to avoid a particular highway interchange, the same one every single time. A generic response smiles politely and moves on to the next topic. A specific response asks, half joking, what that interchange ever did to her. It's a small thing, and it costs nothing. But it proves, in a way words alone can't, that someone was actually tracking what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Of course, this doesn't mean every compliment is meaningless, or that every man who notices her appearance has failed some invisible exam. Context always matters here. A well-placed compliment, given once and meant sincerely, can still land beautifully, especially later in a conversation rather than as an opening line. But when the pattern repeats, generic reaction after generic reaction, stranger after stranger, all interchangeable, it confirms something she has already come to expect. And that expectation is exactly what most men walk straight into, without ever knowing a test occurred, let alone that they failed it. It's worth saying plainly that this isn't a trick question she's testing you against on purpose. Nobody consciously decides to run this evaluation. It happens automatically, the same way you'd notice a familiar smell before you could explain why. Knowing the test exists is one thing. Understanding why it trips up, even confident, successful men, is where this gets personal. You'd think the confident guy has the advantage here. Often, he has the opposite. Confidence, on its own, tends to broadcast one thing above all else: self-assuredness. It says, I am comfortable, I know my value, I am not nervous in this moment. Those are good qualities, and they matter in plenty of other contexts. But none of them actually answer the question her filtering system is quietly running underneath the conversation. Confidence is about him. The test is about her. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't a confident man also be specific and attentive at the same time? Absolutely. And the men who manage both tend to do exceptionally well, far better than confidence alone could ever explain on its own. But here's the detail that separates the two. Confidence can exist completely without a single moment of real attention ever taking place. A man can walk into a conversation entirely at ease, deliver smooth lines, hold strong eye contact, even tell a great story, and still never once respond to anything unique about the woman standing in front of him. He's simply performing well to whoever happened to be standing there that particular night. That distinction matters, and it explains something that confuses a lot of otherwise successful men. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where things felt easy, even good, but somehow nothing deepened afterward. There's a decent chance what was missing wasn't confidence at all. It was specificity, the sense that you were responding to her, not simply to the situation. Before we move further into this, there's a related trap worth naming. Some men, once they learn specificity matters, start manufacturing it, memorizing details to repeat back like a script. That almost never works because it reintroduces the exact problem it's trying to solve. A woman who has spent years being evaluated on the surface tends to notice when a detail is being deployed rather than genuinely remembered. What actually works is simpler, genuine attention, not rehearsed attention. There's also a quieter mistake underneath this one. Some men assume specificity has to be dramatic, a grand gesture, an elaborate callback, something that announces itself loudly. It doesn't. The smallest, most understated version of noticing is usually the most convincing, precisely because it doesn't look like it's trying to prove anything. This is the part almost nobody tells you. The thing beautiful women rarely say out loud, even to people close to them. There's one thing beautiful women almost never say out loud, because saying it feels like admitting a weakness or exposing something too private to name directly. They are quietly starving to be noticed for something that has nothing to do with how they look. Not ignored, noticed. There's a difference. Being looked at happens to her constantly, from strangers who will never learn her name. Being seen happens rarely enough that when it does, she remembers it, sometimes for years. Picture a woman mentioning, almost in passing, that she reorganizes her bookshelf by color instead of by author, and feeling slightly embarrassed about it afterward. Most men let that detail pass entirely, already moving toward the next thing to say. But a man who circles back to it later, not with a big gesture, just a quiet, "Wait, you actually do that with every shelf?" has done something that almost never happens to her. He has responded to something true and specific instead of something visible and universal. Notice what didn't happen in that moment. He didn't compliment her or turn the detail into a joke or use it as a bridge to talk about himself. He simply reflected it back, accurately, a smaller thing than most men assume and a rarer thing than most men realize. This is the part that surprises people most. It would be reasonable to assume that beautiful women, given how much attention they already receive, would eventually stop caring about being noticed at all. The opposite tends to happen, because so much of the attention she receives is interchangeable. The rare instance of real recognition stays vivid, precisely because almost nothing else around it looks the same. Before we move to why this matters so much, there is one additional layer that most explanations completely skip over. It isn't just that specific attention feels nice, the way a compliment feels nice for a moment and then fades. Psychologists who study intimacy describe this as being known. The experience of having an internal, private detail reflected back accurately by another person. In plain terms, it's proof that someone was actually listening, not just present. That proof is rare for anyone. For a woman constantly evaluated on appearance, it is almost non-existent. Of course, this doesn't mean every man needs to memorize trivia about a woman to prove he's paying attention. That would defeat the entire point. It would become performance again. One instance of noticing means very little on its own. A single well-timed comment can be a lucky guess. A pattern of it, repeated naturally over time, means almost everything. It shows up everywhere. In friendships, in the way a woman describes the one coworker who actually remembers what she said weeks earlier. Beauty just amplifies the contrast. This is the answer to the question we opened with at the very start of this video. This is what she is checking for in those first 10 seconds and what she keeps checking for long after those 10 seconds have passed. Not admiration, not attention, recognition. The sense that you see her as a specific person, not a category she happens to belong to. Remember what I told you at the start of this video, that there was one signal most men not only miss, but actively misread. This is it. And once you see it, You cannot unsee it. Now that you know what she's actually reading, the room looks different in a way that's hard to unsee once it clicks. You start noticing the difference between a generic reaction and a specific one in yourself and in other men around you. You start catching the exact moment where a conversation could either stay surface level or actually deepen, and understanding what tips it one way or the other, almost like watching a decision get made in real time. This isn't about memorizing tactics or performing attentiveness on command. That would put you right back where most men already are, just with slightly better lines. It's simpler than that and slower than that, and it doesn't require a script. It's the habit of actually listening for the detail instead of waiting for your turn to speak. It's noticing the offhand comment instead of steering past it towards something easier and more familiar. There's something almost relieving about that. You don't need a better opening line. You don't need to become more confident or more polished than you already are. Those things were never the actual obstacle, even though they're what most advice focuses on. The obstacle was always attention itself, the quality of it, not the quantity. This also changes how you'll experience the moments that don't work out. Not every conversation is going to deepen, no matter how attentive you become. Some people simply aren't a match for reasons that have nothing to do with how well you listened. What changes is that you'll stop mistaking a lack of connection for a lack of skill. None of this requires you to become someone you're not. You only need to slow down slightly in the moments that matter and let the other person's words actually land before you respond. That shift is the whole point of this video, and it's only the beginning of what most men get wrong. So here's the pattern underneath everything we've covered today, the thread running through all of it. Beautiful women aren't running from attention. They're filtering for something attention rarely provides. Generic reactions, however confident or well delivered, register as background noise, familiar and forgettable. Specific ones, small, accurate, unforced, register as something closer to being known. The zoomed out truth is simpler than any of the individual signals we covered along the way. Every person, regardless of how they look, wants to be responded to as themselves rather than as a category they fit into. Beauty simply raises the stakes because it invites so many generic reactions that the specific ones stand out even more sharply by comparison, almost like a single clear note in a noisy room. You now have something most men never bother to develop. Not a line, not a technique, not a script to memorize before a date. You have a way of paying attention that actually registers, that separates you from a pattern she has already seen play out more times than she could count. You don't need to overanalyze every conversation looking for a hidden test to pass. That would turn noticing into performing, which defeats the purpose entirely. Just stay curious about the specific person in front of you and let the rest follow naturally. I'd genuinely like to know. Have you ever caught yourself running that same first 10 seconds judgment on someone else without realizing it? Tell me where it happened in the comments below. I read every one of them, and some of the most useful patterns on this channel started as a comment exactly like that, from someone noticing something in their own life they hadn't put words to yet. If this kind of insight is genuinely useful to you, this channel exists to keep giving it to you. One honest, specific truth at a time, without the noise most of this advice usually comes wrapped in. Next time, I'll show you the exact phrase pattern that fails this test, the one almost every man uses without ever knowing it's working against him.